Hi guys, welcome back to Less is More. My name is Dan Wellman and today we'll continue looking at mixins, this time focusing on a more powerful version called parametric mixins. These are just like the standard mixins that we used in the last part, except that these mixins are defined like functions which accept parameters, hence the name parametric. This opens up some interesting and powerful possibilities. You may have noticed when we were adding our Microsoft opacity mixin, as well as the 100% opacity filter that we created a mixin for, there were some instances of the opacity with different amounts of opacity. Now we could just define another mixin that was set to the other amount of opacity, but a better way would be to combine them both with a parametric mixin, where the opacity amount was specified using a parameter each time the mixin was used. So this allows us to use a single mixin and configure the amount that it outputs when we use it. So let's change our mixin so that it can do this. So we've got our MS opacity mixin here, and the value is hard-coded in, so we want to change that. So what we'll do is just specify some parentheses after the mixin name, and we'll specify that the value passed in should be stored in the opacity variable. So just like in JavaScript, when you pass a parameter into a function, that parameter is available inside the function as if it were a standard variable. So it's exactly the same as that with less. So we can use the variable. In this first one, actually, because the string is quoted, then we need to use the string interpolation feature that we looked at earlier. So we can change this from the hard-coded 100 value, and we'll just set that to be the variable instead. And down here in the second one, we don't need to use interpolation here, so we can just use the variable as is. Okay, so our mixin is now much more flexible. So we need to just go through and update where we used our mixin so that it uses the argument. So let's just find the previous occurrences. And this was one of the 100% ones, so we'll pass in 100 as we did before. There's another one. Yeah, that's fine. So we should now be able to compile this without getting errors. And if we look for the Microsoft filter in the generated CSS, yeah, see, it's come out with the value that we passed into the mixin. So now we can go through and find some other versions which use different amounts of opacity. So here's one that uses 65. So instead of having all this malarkey here, we can just use our mixin and specify a different amount. So we'll just take a look at the generated CSS again. And it's used the updated variable. So that's great. So our mixin is now much more flexible, and we can use it in more places than we were able to before. So one other thing that we can do with parametric mixins, just a minute ago when I tried to crunch the file before updating the 100% versions, it threw an error. Now 100% is the most common value used throughout this file. 65% is used a couple of times, but it's mostly 100%. So what we can do is define 100% as the default value, and then we only need to specify it when it's different. So to do that, we can just define the argument as if it were a standard variable. So we use the colon and then specify the default amount. And now we only have to specify the amount when we use the mixin if it's going to differ from 100. So now we can go back and we don't need to pass in 100 anymore when we use it. think there were just 2 occurrences. Yeah, okay, great. Oh. So if we compile the file again, then see, we've not specified 100, but it's used the default amount of 100, so that's great. Then there's another one up here, and because we have specified a value, it's used the value that we specified. So our opacity mixin is Microsoft specific at the moment, but there's no reason why we can't use it for all of our opacity requirements. So we can update it again. So we go back to our less file and go back up to our mixin up here. So most browsers don't use a value between 0 and 100, they use a value between 0 and 1. So we'll specify 1 as the default value that gets passed in, and we can just change this so that it's more reflective of what the mixin does. So we'll call it all opacity because we're going to use it for all instances of opacity. So we can set a new variable at the top, which is just going to be used for Microsoft. And here we just multiply the value that's passed in, or the default value, by 100. And then that will give us the Microsoft version. So down in the Microsoft bits here, we can just change that so that it uses MS opacity. And we can do the same for the filter here. And then we can specify the style that's used by normal browsers just down here, just using whatever value is either passed in or the default value. Okay, so that's great. So now we need to go through and just update where we use this mixin. So we need to change it to our mixin name. So we called it all opacity. So yeah, this is one of the places where we used it earlier. So let's just correct that. So we're not using MS opacity anymore, we're just using all opacity. And I think there was another place where we used it. Yeah, so we can update this as well. So all opacity. And here we can set a different value. And it was 0.5 instead. Let's check there's no more occurrences. No, that's good. So now we can compile that, and when we look for, we'll look for the filter version first. Yeah, so that's fine. So it's come out exactly as we would expect. And if we just try a different value, so this is the default one, 100%. Oh, that's not right, is it? Something's gone wrong. So the problem is in the standard filter definition here, and it's not liking this calculation here. So what we can do to fix that, if we wrap it in a string, and if we use interpolation, and then we'll just need to escape that because we don't want the quotes to come out in the final CSS. So let's try that one more time. So this is where the default value of 100 is used. So this is all as we would expect so far. and now it's using the right amount as we would expect, so that's fine. So if you get unexpected results, then that's something you can try. So just bear that in mind. So there's lots and lots of places throughout our example S file that we could use mix-ins. We could use it for the transitions. So somewhere in the file there are transition styles defined, so we'll just find those. So again, there's lots of vendor prefixes, so we can create a new mix-in for that. So let's just go back up to the top quickly. So we'll add it here after the other ones. So we'll call this one anim. And there's a couple of parameters that need to be used here, so we can pass all of these in. And here we can add all of the boring vendor prefixes. We'll just add the other browser's versions. And we can end it with the standard CSS version. So this is the mix-in for our WebKit transition. So we can replace instances of the transition with our mix-in instead. So let's try these ones because they have all three arguments as we would expect. So because we're passing in parameters, we need to separate them with commas. And we should be able to get rid of all of these now. And if we just have a quick look at the output CSS, so grid li we're looking for. Yeah, so there's our transitions, and we didn't have to type any of that manually, so that's much better. So there are other places where this is used. So let's try using it here. We just need to separate them all out with commas. And now we can get rid of all of those. Okay, great. So yeah, let's try it here. So let's try and compile that. And this time we get an error. And the reason we get an error is because we don't have a mix-in defined that only accepts 2 arguments. Instead, we've got a mix-in that accepts 3 because it expects an easing. So an easing is not specified here. And what we can do to fix that so that we don't have to specify the third argument if we don't want, we can just set a default. So now when we compile, because only 2 arguments are passed in, it uses the default third one, which we've set to ease, and now it works again. So you'll notice that there's a bit of duplication going on inside our mix-in. We're specifying the same 3 arguments over and over again, and obviously one of the whole points of less is to cut down on duplication. So when we're using mix-ins like this, Less actually gives us a special variable that we don't have to define, it's just set up automatically for us, and it's called arguments. And this is just all of the arguments that are passed into the mixin. So we can even cut down on the amount of duplication within our mixins. So that's much better. So in this part we looked at parametric mixins, which are a more powerful and flexible form of the mixins that we originally used in the last part, and they allow us to configure our mixin where it is actually used by passing parameters to it, much like how we would configure a function in JavaScript. In the next part of the series we'll look at an even more powerful type of mixin. Thanks for watching.